Good morning. My name is Martha Stark, and I am a clinical professor here at NYU Wagner. I say here, even though I'm not at NYU Wagner right now, but that is where I'm a clinical professor. I'm a born and bred New Yorker, Brooklyn girl, grew up in NYCHA housing, went to public high school, and I'm so thrilled that we have embarked on this project here at NYU. So welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us. My role this morning is to do two things. The first is, of course, to welcome you. The second is to let you know kind of the, lay of the land and how we're hoping this morning will go. And then I actually get to voice your questions and ask questions of my own, one of my favorite things to sort of do of the panelists. So what we'll do just sort of momentarily to get underway is first off, want to thank all of you for coming and actually introduce you to two folks who were instrumental in us collaborating on this particular opening panel for our NYC 2025 Road to Recovery sort of series. So Dean Sherry Glead, who you'll hear from momentarily, as well as Tanzi Whalen, who's the director for the Center for Sustainable Business. And you'll also hear from her momentarily. So I will, just I'll let you know when they're going to speak. The bios for all of the speakers are put in the chat, and there's a link for them. So I will not go into sort of detail in terms of describing our incredible sort of speakers that are forthcoming, and you can read more about them in the chat. So what I'm going to do then, after turning it over to Sherry and Tanzi, we'll hear about an overview of the project from my incredible colleague, Thad Calabrese, who I've just enjoyed thoroughly working with over the last several years. He and I have known each other. And then what we're going to do is actually have each panelist present their paper. We've given them 12 minutes each, and I'm going to be really hard person in terms of keeping them to those 12 minutes. And then following the 12 minutes, we're hoping to have a bit of time for you to give us questions, to ask questions. And so if this all goes well, we'll wrap up their presentations by around 10 o'clock. So with that, what I thought I would do is actually turn it over to my favorite dean, Dean Sherry Glead, Dean of the Wagner School.
Thank you so much, Martha. Good morning. I'm Sherry Glead. I'm the Dean of NYU Wagner, and I am so pleased to be welcoming you to our NYC 2025 Road to Recovery series. Our goal with this series is to host conversations in partnership with others, with organizations who can engage their audiences in answering the question, how can New York City's recovery post-pandemic be both inclusive and equitable? Today's discussion is the first in the series, and it follows the official release of our NYC 2025 project, which I'm really excited about, and that Professor Calabrese Thad is going to discuss in more detail. NYU Wagner is in a great position to lead this conversation. Our key faculty here, Martha and Thad, as well as many others, are deeply engaged in the discussion around the issues that impact the city most deeply. And we've pulled together a really distinguished advisory board that offers really strong expertise in New York City affairs. I'm very grateful to the Stern Center for Sustainable Business for partnering with us on today's event. And thank you to our NYC 2025 advisory board, to Martha, to Thad, to the incomparable Raquel Forrester, who's really helped us through all of this, and to our generous sponsors, the Revson Altman and Altman Foundations, the New York Community Trust, and the J.M. Kaplan Foundation for supporting our vision. This week, the NYC 2025 papers were all published on the Wagner website. You can look in the chat for more information, and please be sure to sign up to receive more information on future events and releases. I'm now going to pass this along to Tanzi Whalen, who's the director of the Stern Center for Sustainable Business. Tanzi.
Thank you so much, Sherry, and thank you, Martha. It's a pleasure to be partnering with you on this. And Martha, I also am a born and bred New Yorker girl. And, live in Brooklyn now, grew up in Manhattan, but really pleased to be part of work to, work together on our city to make it more sustainable, more inclusive, and to have it live up to the potential and the reality that all of us know and love, but also worry about in terms of the things that we need to improve. So it's, again, an honor to be working with you. We, together, I think, demonstrate the strength of bringing government, public policy specialists, private sector, civil society, and others together. We need that multi-stakeholder approach to be able to tackle the challenges that we're confronting, as well as the opportunities that I think every part of that kind of multi-stakeholder coalition can bring to bear. And today you'll be hearing in the discussion from experts across a range of disciplines around issues ranging from expanding loan programs for micromobility vehicles, for low-income essential workers, to supporting the city's economic development through the direct investment of pension funds. Really interesting to see the announcement they made the other day around, committing to net zero in their pension funds. And I think that, as we think about innovative policy ideas for everything from prioritizing inclusivity and equality in the city's economic growth, to increasing the flexibility with which New York City responds to change. I hope that this event, collaboration, really helps serve as a model. And I believe that collaboration will be critical moving forward. The private sector has resources to bring to the table, and I think we don't always harness them and engage them in the ways that we could to have business be more of a force for good than as it can be a force for inequality. So I want to, one last point is thank my colleague, Mariana Koval, who is leading our Invest NYC SDG initiative. You'll hear from her later, but she and the team that she's been working with, the advisory board for that group, I think some of the members are here today, really, developing fascinating ideas for how we can help New York City meet the sustainable development goals, from climate to affordable housing and so on. So again, thank you to NYU Wagner for hosting this event, for including us in this conversation. And I'm pleased now to hand it over to Thad Calabrese, who is NYU Wagner Associate Professor of Public and Nonprofit Financial Management. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. Following up on a couple of things that Martha and Sherry already mentioned, the NYC 2025 project was born out of a sense that New York was at a crossroads. The global pandemic has changed our city, and we could not take it for granted that recovery would occur at all, or that the recoveries we had experienced in the past were the desirable ones that we were looking for. The city also has an election next month in a few weeks that will see a new mayor, a new controller, and more than half of city council members who will be brand new to that legislative body. And the goal of NYC 2025 was to bring together experts in policy areas critical to New York City's stabilization and growth. And these experts were pulled from academia, from citizen groups, nonprofit organizations, and private companies. And as Sherry noted, the goals of the group is to think about what policies would help economic recovery for the city, but to also keep in mind that recovery needs to be done in a just and inclusive way as well, which has not always been the case in New York City's history. The project has an amazing and accomplished advisory board. I hope you go and look at the list on the website of folks who have engaged with us. It's been an honor and a pleasure to work with them, as well as with Martha, who's co-editor of the project. And we currently have nearly 30 policy papers on a wide range of projects, from tax policy to criminal justice to dealing with homelessness as just a few examples. You can see the link in the chat for the papers from today's event, but I hope you also take some time and go to our website where this week we went live with our policy proposals. We also are posting data of interest on various policy and financial issues on the website that we have. We've had great support from students at Wagner in gathering data, which will be useful in thinking about policy, other policy proposals and other issues that are important to New York City's recovery. So I'm going to hand it back to Martha so we can begin our conversation.
Great, Thad, thank you so much. So why don't we just get underway right away with a discussion that's going to start with thinking about federal investment dollars. So what can the city sort of do in terms of using the federal investment dollars that are going to come our way? I just wanted to also say the reason NYC 2025 is because we want to see this project through and see what happens with the first 4 years of our sort of new administration that Thad described. So with that, I'm going to actually turn this over to Karen Bruggeman, who's going to talk us through some ideas about how New York City can leverage the new sort of federal investments that we're going to get. And her paper, which she co-authored with Bruce Katz, who's on our advisory group, Colin Higgins and Brian Reyes, is entitled From City Hall to City Network, How We Catalyze the Inclusive Recovery of New York City. Karen.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you all so much for having me here. It's really a pleasure. And I'll feel deeply insecure that I'm not a New Yorker among this group. So I think in that sense, feel free to take me with a grain of salt. I am a poor substitute for Bruce Katz, who's the director of the NOAC Metro Finance Lab at Drexel University, where I work. He is a native New Yorker, and I think I wish he could have been here. He would have brought a really unique perspective, but I'm excited to talk about our paper. Just to back up a little bit, I will say at the NOAC Lab, we've been working over the past 6 or 7 months with a cohort of cities on implementation of the American Rescue Plan and how cities are managing the funds and bringing people together to set up strategic priorities and how they're actually deploying the funds in a way that can be equitable and inclusive and have a transformative impact on particularly the most disadvantaged communities that really suffered during the pandemic. So we've learned a lot from that experience over the past few months. It's been challenging on a lot of levels. And I think the main way we're approaching this is thinking about future rounds of federal stimulus. We've all surely been following the conversation about the infrastructure bill and the budget reconciliation bill. It's also been a little bit lost in the conversation, but Senator Schumer really championed the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, which would have a lot of R&D funds and funds for innovation. These are big initiatives that, if they pass, will require cities, including New York, to organize themselves and organize the deployment of these funds in ways that are transformative. And they're all different beasts. So the reason the paper is called From City Hall to City Networks is when we were thinking about the American Rescue Plan, it had $350 billion in state and local fiscal recovery funds that went directly to states and cities. New York City received $5.9 billion directly that had some restraints on them, but were pretty flexible in the grand scheme of things. And that bucket alone required a lot of organizing capacity from cities. In a lot of places, it was capacity that they didn't have, mostly in smaller to mid-sized cities. ARPA was huge because the pandemic and the impact that it had was huge, and it touched on everything. So that relief bill touched on almost every policy issue across the spectrum. It had healthcare funds, transit funds, education funds, childcare funds, small business relief funds. It was massive, and it was hard for local leaders to kind of wrap their head around what of this money was flowing to my city, who was it impacting, who was it leaving out, what was the long-term impact of this? It'll be really difficult to measure. And so moving forward, when we think about the infrastructure bill or the reconciliation bill, they're going to pose similar challenges. And I think our main thinking is that if people don't try to wrangle with this and structure the governance of how they manage the funds differently, at the end of the day, what is it really going to add up to? And what kind of impact is it going to have that we can point to 5 or 10 years from now? I think, historically, Bruce Katz at the NOAC Lab thinks a lot about how money flows from the federal to the local level in a way that realizes that some of these systems are broken. They were built 100 years ago. They're not structured for modern societies and systems. You know, and we have to reimagine how these things are going to work. You know what, Martha, I'm so sorry. Could I take 1 second? I need to go. I'm in Philadelphia at a hotel room, and I think I've escaped. They're not going to try to kick me out of this room. I apologize, everyone. But basically, to get back to what I was saying, when we think about infrastructure, you know, the way the funds are going to flow, it's ARPA, a lot of the money went to the city and the city had a lot of control. With infrastructure, that's not really going to be the case. You're going to have money flowing to the Port Authority, to airports, to Amtrak, to freight rail, to, you know, roads and bridges, which is mostly determined and controlled by the state. You're going to have broadband funds that go to the state. So there's going to be a lot of different actors. And if you want to have how the money is spent add up to something that is bigger than the sum of its parts, the mayor alone, city hall alone isn't going to influence that. It's going to take a lot of convening and bringing people to the table to say, who here is receiving money from this bill and what are you planning to do about it? What are the projects that you're prioritizing? And I think the reason that this type of convening and this type of networked governance and bringing people together, the reason that it matters is there's cross-cutting issues that are going to impact everything. When you think about infrastructure specifically, the reason we really want people to build city networks to kind of think about this holistically are things like workforce. You know, all of these different entities are going to be deploying construction projects, which implicate the construction workforce. It's the same set of workers, but it's projects that are managed by different entities that aren't coordinating. You have supplier diversity. They're going to be issuing contracts to the same subset of primes and subcontractors to execute on these projects. And that's a real opportunity to build supplier diversity and to think about who's actually getting those contracts and what are the implications for building wealth in traditionally disadvantaged communities. You also have the ability, hypothetically, if we can organize, to think about where these funds are going in a geographic spatial manner, what neighborhoods are benefiting from the spending of these funds, and is it coordinated? I think with infrastructure, that's a really discrete, targeted set of investments. But with the reconciliation bill and with some of the ARPA funds, you know, thinking about there's housing funds, there could be funds for school renovation and construction, there's going to be transit funds and climate resiliency funds. If you look at a specific neighborhood, what is the net impact of all of those disparate investments that are going through, channeled through different entities at the local level? And is there some measure of coordination in terms of them, you know, if a school is being renovated, what are the transit options? What's the housing in that neighborhood? I think lots of cities think about this, but there's still, you know, the prospect of this new round of federal funding raises the stakes of what not coordinating will mean, and it'll lessen the impact over time. So I think the main message is that fragmentation requires coordination, because without coordination, you risk losing some of the collective impact that some of these new funds could have. And I think, you know, I realize I've read over some of the other papers that go into much more specifics about sustainability and climate. I think this is just thinking about the moment in time that we're in. With the pandemic, you had all the relief bills, these new rounds of federal stimulus funds. You know, they're getting scaled back by the day, potentially, but thinking about this in terms of the New Deal, the Great Society, the recovery from the recession 10 years ago, and kind of thinking about how New York is going to manage this moment and do something really creative and big with it if these federal funds come through. So that's kind of how we're thinking about this generally. And, you know, I think from working with cities over the past 6 months, we've learned a lot about, from ARPA implementation, things about how it really demanded a lot more capacity than exists, the relationship between cities and states, how implementation is slow, the politics of allocating all this money is extremely complicated. So then I think, you know, what does it mean? I think I'll transition into kind of what does it mean to set up a recovery network? With this cohort of cities that we've worked with, we've been calling them stimulus command centers, but really the name of the entity that is in place to manage the flow of funds, it doesn't really matter, a recovery network, but it's what structure exists to actually coordinate big picture how funds are flowing. And kind of the basic steps that we would advocate for doing this are setting up a recovery network, which convenes leaders from every entity that's going to be receiving any federal funds, but also bringing in people from the philanthropic world and the corporate world to see how they can supplement those efforts, bringing in grassroots leaders who are going to have creative ideas about project identification and implementation, bringing in banks. I think when you think about supplier diversity and contracting, what role is there in all this to build up small businesses in new and creative ways, needing to have those people at the table. Thinking about state leaders, obviously the governance of a lot of the public authorities in New York City is uniquely complicated because of all the different state relationships that they have. So coordination in that sense matters. And I think with this, you know, I will say candidly, we advocate for these kind of cross-sector collaborative initiatives. It's hard. I think the reason that it's promising is that city capacity is limited. People are busy. People have so much that they're already doing. I think in an ideal world, the idea of having this type of network and convening and communicating happening, it doesn't have to be focused in City Hall. It could be situated and kind of based out of a philanthropy that actually has the funds to hire staff, to lend research support and data analytics support, to lend engagement and convening support. We realize, especially in cities smaller than New York, not a lot of cities have the capacity to hire a bunch of new people to think about this or manage it, but thinking about other stakeholders in a city that do have the capacity and the resources to actually hire people to work on this and kind of think big picture and connect the dots. That's what we're really getting at when we talk about bringing in outside actors, because we realize cities and states are limited in what they can do. So I think I'll real quick, I don't know where I am at on time, but I'll have Raquel just pop up to the 2 slides that I sent her if she's able. I think the point here is basically just to go, I've talked a lot about infrastructure, but even with the rescue plan, I think for the next mayor over the next few years, yeah, this is the right slide. There's still a lot of facets of the rescue plan that will be spent down over the next 5 to 10 years. We think about that bill as like, you know, the individual aid, the small business aid, so much of it has already gone out the door, but there are some really big programs that are really interesting and really meaningful that the next mayor will still have the ability to convene people around and like understand the progress that's been made and identify capacity gaps and new goals. You know, the K-12 funds are going to be spent down over multiple years. There's a state small business credit initiative to really capitalize and grow small businesses. That money flows through the state, but that program hasn't even gotten underway. There's things like the Capital Projects Fund for broadband connectivity, which also hasn't gotten underway. There were some competitive grants through the Commerce Department, which I actually don't know if New York submitted an application for the first deadline. That was a few days ago, but those applications are still open and still coming in. So I guess the general point is, you know, this is a long game and there's still an opportunity to organize and bring people together around ARPA. On the next slide for infrastructure, it's really just to illustrate the point that there's all these funds across disparate like they're going to go towards discrete issue areas and projects, but at the end of the day, it implicates a lot of different local actors and the need for coordination among those actors, and to actually measure some kind of local effect is important. So I don't know if that's a helpful visualization. I think we're going to be working on how we actually help people visualize this over time. But yeah, I think with that, I would probably pass it back to Martha and would welcome discussion later on. But yeah, would welcome people's thoughts.
Karen, thank you so much for starting us out with the funding that will be available to the city, and the sort of important point of how fragmentation really requires coordination. And we'll talk later about, you know, who should be in the lead of that coordination and how some of the groups that have traditionally been excluded can actually get a seat at the table. So thank you so much for getting us started in that regard. Next, I'm going to turn it over to a friend and colleague and a person who, you know, is so smart and so exciting to kind of work with, given all that she's been doing. And she's going to actually talk about a topic near and dear to my heart, as I used to, as finance commissioner, chair 2 of the pension funds. And so having Gail Horowitz talk a little bit about pension funds and economic development. So we get this sort of big idea of what we can do with federal dollars that we're likely to get, but what can we do ourselves using and leveraging the funds that the pension funds might bring to bear. So with that, Gail, I'll turn this over to you. I just want to let everyone know we were about 3 minutes behind, which is, sort of why. So Gail is starting at about 9:28, and so I'll, stop her at around 9:40.
Great, thank you, Martha, and good morning. It was a very, very kind and generous introduction. It's a pleasure to join you all today at my alma mater. I'm a proud graduate of the Wagner School, and I'm delighted to be part of this very, very important conversation. When Martha contacted me a few months ago to tackle the question of how the pension funds could be used to help support the city's economic recovery, I began to brainstorm ideas, some new and some old. I settled on an old but new to New York City idea of the pension funds serving as a catalyst for growth, specifically through direct investment of funds in infrastructure projects. My paper specifically addresses direct investment in public, or often called social infrastructure, as a means to invest in our own future while preserving pension benefits for retirees, capitalizing on city assets, and easing the debt burden on the city's expense budget. I will quickly provide a brief overview of economically targeted investments, ETIs, and pension funds, how they've worked together, the use of direct investments in infrastructure by other pension funds, and the case for New York City. The use of pension fund assets to support public policy objectives beyond paying retiree benefits is an established concept. According to the New York City Comptroller's Office, here in New York City, since the 1980s, $3.9 billion has been invested in New York City's 5 boroughs and the 6 surrounding New York counties. And currently 2% of pension fund assets are allocated to ETIs, with a goal of promoting economic development and achieving risk-adjusted market rates of return. Examples of these types of investments include 2 investments by the New York City pension funds focused on affordable or workforce housing for low, moderate, and middle-income neighborhoods in the city. First, in 2002, back when Martha was in the pension funds, the funds began investing in the AFL-CIO Investment Housing Trust. And as of December 2020, $1.5 billion has been invested in the trust to create or preserve 35,181 units of housing. Second, since 2007, the pension funds have invested an additional $968 million in an affordable housing anti-predatory lending strategy managed by RBC Access Capital, which invests in single-family mortgage-backed securities impacting over 46,000 units of housing. These investments have helped to revitalize neighborhoods and bring needed property tax revenue to the city, while also ensuring that the pension funds meet their fiduciary duty to generate a risk-adjusted return in order to pay benefits. Pension funds across the country and around the globe have taken this a step further. The retirement system of Alabama is reported to have invested 16% of its assets in the state and local economy. CalPERS in California has invested equity in the investor-owned London Gatwick Airport, and the Indiana Toll Road project was rescued by a consortium of 70 US public pension funds. The Canadian pension funds are probably best known for moving beyond these ETIs to direct infrastructure investment and management. They treat it as a separate asset, and it's part of their allocation to inflation-sensitive instruments. The Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System created an in-house entity devoted exclusively to direct investment and management of public infrastructure. In 2015, they were one of 3 Canadian pension funds to form a consortium to purchase the lease for the Chicago Skyway project for $2.8 billion, giving them the rights to operate and collect tolls until 2104. Direct investment is starting to pick up steam in the US, with CalPERS at the forefront. CalPERS being the California Public Employees Retirement System. In 2015, CalPERS announced a $1 billion deal with an Australian pension fund, Queensland Investment Corp, to invest in Asian Pacific infrastructure. They did not use the intermediary of a private equity fund, avoiding the associated fees, but rather used a direct investment and joined forces with an experienced infrastructure investor. CalSTRS, which is the teachers' retirement system in California, also recently made a direct investment in a partnership with a Dutch pension fund. It's time to turn these investments back home, and the New York City pension funds can take the lead. Before I talk about this additional investment vehicle in the pension funds toolkit, let's first review how the city currently finances its infrastructure and why it's important to have an alternative. New York City sells bonds to finance its public infrastructure, including new construction, improvements, and equipment. The bonds are backed by general obligations, taxes that the city collects, as well as fees and other revenues collected by the city. Debt service payments on the bonds are paid out of the expense budget. It's also important to note that the expenses associated with the projects being built are initially paid out of the city's expense budget, their general fund. Once this bending occurs, bonds are issued and the revenue is used to reimburse the general fund. According to the New York City Comptroller's Office, New York City's debt outstanding has grown from $39.55 billion to $95.03 billion, or 140% from fiscal year 2000 to fiscal year 2020. Annual average growth rate of the city debt service payments was 4.1% per year for the same time period, or $6.65 billion in fiscal year 2020. From 2021 to 2029, the city's OMB forecasts that the rate of growth will be 6%, or $11.65 billion by 2029. New York City's debt burden per capita is more than twice the average of a sample of 11 other large US cities. Direct investment of the city's pensions funds into a select group of infrastructure projects would enable the city to reduce this burden to fund the initial payments from its expense budget, while also helping to reduce the debt service expenses as well. With the right type of projects, the pension funds would be able to realize a market rate of return for their investment, while also contributing to the long-term sustainability of the city's infrastructure. This scenario would be a win-win, or in economic development parlance, a double bottom line return. If the projects chosen add a sustainability component, as in solar panels on city buildings, we have now accomplished the triple bottom line. For NYCers, the city retirement systems, an increase of their allocation to ETIs from 2 to 10%, for example, through direct investment, would dramatically change the pace of infrastructure building in New York City for generations and pay social dividends for decades. One project ripe for direct investment is the city's $157 million investment to close the digital divide in New York City. According to the New York City Internet Master Plan, broadband may be as important to New York City in the 21st century as the subway or electricity was in the 20th century. The city plans to seed this investment to build the infrastructure required and leverage partnerships to install, operate, and maintain the infrastructure. This project could benefit from the involvement of the pension funds through a direct investment, permitting the city to reduce its investment and redistribute those dollars to other badly needed city services. The master plan further projects that getting all New Yorkers connected and establishing equitable infrastructure citywide could, in the best case scenario, result in up to 165,000 new jobs, up to $49 billion increase in personal income, and up to $142 billion in incremental gross city product by 2045. The pension funds should and must be an instrumental player in enabling this important effort to be successful, accomplishing the double bottom line of doing well while doing good. Direct investment of this nature will require a fundamental rethinking of how to finance public projects. According to the Minnesota Center for Fiscal Excellence, direct infrastructure investment by pension plans is really only part of a much larger policy framework to generate capital to invest in new assets or refurbish existing public assets. Direct investment is but an additional tool in the range of tools to finance public infrastructure and enables the discussion to move past a choice between public or private ownership. NYCers could act as the anchor investor in projects, attracting further direct investment from CalPERS, CalSTRS, or even the Canadian pension funds, as well as the union pension funds. There's no shortage of projects to be funded, and pension funds are in a unique position to provide the needed capital as a long-term investor looking to double or triple the bottom line. Direct public pension fund investment in New York City's public infrastructure must be seriously explored by NYCers, putting the pension funds at the forefront of leading New York City's recovery. This initiative requires no new taxes and no additional debt. It will require convening the best minds in municipal finance and public pension investments to harness New York's entrepreneurial spirit and diverse workforce to identify the best projects for investment. And it will require the courage to change the conversation to meet the growing demands in New York City. In short, it will require leadership to help the city build back better than ever. Thank you, Martha. Hopefully I got you on schedule.
You sure did. We just wanted to know, Gail, you had prepared some slides. Anyone in particular you might
No,
want
they were just an
highlight?
overview, so it should be fine. You don't have to.
Fantastic, and we'll make those available to everybody. Thank you so much, Gail, for that. Really, really helpful to know how we can do well by doing good, and using a vehicle like the pension funds is incredibly helpful in that regard. So now I want to turn it over actually to a person who has more energy without coffee than anyone I've encountered in the last several years, Mariana Koval, who has written incredible paper about creating a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient future economy in New York City. And it's been an absolute pleasure working with Mariana on this, her reading, and just really getting encouraged by her energy, and her bio is available, and it's incredibly impressive. And so with that, I'll turn it over to you, Mariana, for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. And I did have one cup of coffee this morning. So be warned. Thank you, Martha and Thad, and also Raquel. It's been an honor to work with you, and it's also been a lot of fun. I'll just move on to outlining my really very simple policy proposal. As we look to create New York City's road to recovery, let it be a road to the future with sustainable development. That means economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. Balancing these three elements and placing racial equity and justice at the center is our task, and a powerful framework exists. Facing daunting global challenges, including climate change, poverty, hunger, racial and gender inequity, the United Nations acted and advanced the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs, in 2015. Sharing these daunting challenges, New York City heeded the call from the UN to mobilize in response. We embedded the principles of the SDGs in our own sustainability plan, One NYC 2050, and we led the world in taking that plan and mapping it against the SDGs in 2019. As a world finance center, many New York City-based multinational corporations have stepped up, and they've made specific commitments to achieving the SDGs. New York City can continue to lead the world's cities by evolving our own planning process. As the incoming mayor develops the next sustainability plan in 2023, I suggest that he and his administration secure the active agreement of government, community, and the private sector on the goals and priorities of the city's plan. Make the private sector a true partner. And most importantly for success, get the commitment for each non-government sector to measurable actions to achieve those goals, accountability. And that needed private investment will also require innovative cross-sector project development to direct capital to where it's needed most. So this is all a lot of acronyms and high level. What could new processes and this cross-sector project development produce? This is the work we're trying to do here at the Center for Sustainable Development. Imagine, for example, a new future for Rikers Island, 413 acres in the middle of our city. It's slated to be decarcerated by 2027. A site for solar, a site for a state-of-the-art water resource recovery facility? Absolutely. We could also create a thriving 30-acre commercial indoor farm, grow 500,000 pounds of greens and vegetables and 90,000 pounds of fish weekly, year-round, supporting our city's food resilience. We can employ 600 to 700 formerly incarcerated returning citizens, providing a second chance. And we can create a clear route to generational wealth with worker ownership through an ESOP, employee stock ownership plan, or a worker cooperative. But let me back up and give you the context and the background. I became the director of Invest NYC SDG. It's a lumpy title. It's an initiative of the Center for Sustainable Business at NYU Stern, and I became the director in 2019. My charge was to build private investment in impactful projects that advance New York City's sustainability goals using the UN SDGs as the framework, drive the SDGs locally. It was really hard to get my hands around it. So we began research looking at 6 areas: the built environment, waste, food and health, sustainable mobility, climate resilience, and renewable energy. You can do the next slide that shows those buckets, Raquel. Oh, well, that's one, those are the buckets. And I realized quickly that the private sector couldn't do a lot alone. New York City's sustainability goals were created by government. Government owns or controls the key policy and infrastructure, and the private sector would have to work with government, and both would have to work with the community and make environmental justice core. We keep talking about this, cross-sector collaboration. So I'm at NYU. I made a Venn diagram to show the critical overlap of interests. Here's where we'll work. So I stepped back to understand New York City's sustainability planning and goals. What has been done? What exists now? What can it be? And how do we get there? Well, what's been done? New York City has led the world in setting ambitious urban sustainability goals, beginning with Plan NYC with Mayor Michael Bloomberg. That 2007 long-term plan made explicit the critical link between New York City's population and economic growth and the health and viability of its natural and built environment and infrastructure. 8 years later, the UN members ratified the SDGs, providing a roadmap to improve human welfare, protect the Earth's resources, and ensure greater and more equitably shared prosperity. What exists now? Building on Mayor Bloomberg's plan, Mayor Bill de Blasio launched One NYC 2050 in 2015 and updated that plan in 2019, reflecting the UN SDGs and integrating goals of economic growth and prosperity with principles of equality, sustainability, and resiliency. The city also committed to the Paris Climate Accord and became the first city in the world to map its sustainability plan against the SDGs. Yet, as I read One NYC 2050, sometimes skimming all 8 volumes, I looked at the advisory board, 39 members with many really impressive civic and environmental leaders, but only 8 arguably from the private sector and none from finance. That was important to me. Let's back up. You might ask, do the SDGs have any application to New York City? Initially, when I read about them, I thought they were really goals for developing countries. But the same global socioeconomic and environmental challenges that the SDGs address clearly apply in New York. The Great Recession, natural disasters, and of course, a global pandemic have exposed and exacerbated the vulnerabilities in New York City's economy. New Yorkers face unemployment, a widening wealth gap, increasing wage stagnation, vast housing insecurity. 16% of the population lives in poverty. COVID-19 has driven high unemployment. It's increased food insecurity to include more than 1.5 million New Yorkers, or maybe more. And that fact prompted our development of a plan for a 30-acre indoor farm on Rikers, invited by the mayor's office. But as a global city with a diversified economy, New York City is primed to take on these challenges. We're home to the UN, one of the world's leading centers for finance, media, technology, the arts, and fashion, and the base for more than 40 Fortune 500 companies, a leading supporter of business accelerators, the hub of major philanthropic foundations, and home to sophisticated non-government organizations and community-based organizations. So what's the next step? New York City requires a new citywide sustainability plan every 4 years, with the next due April 2023. It really does provide a unique convening platform, and a lot is at stake. What can our next plan be, and how do we get there? I like alliteration. I say it's about process, people, and promises. Who should be at the table? Well, we all say the stakeholders. How should they work together? Consensus? Forget about it. This is New York City. Cross-sector collaboration? Yes, sure, but what does that mean? One part of it has to be creating goals and identifying metrics or indicators by which to measure success or failure, taking responsibility. And here's what I propose. First, as a new administration develops its sustainability agenda, let's recognize the value of the private sector. The UN sees the private sector as an essential partner. It identified 12 trillion in business investments and 360 million jobs that could be achieved if it could be created if the SDGs were achieved. Over the past 6 years, the world's business and finance community has begun to mobilize. Many multinational corporations have embraced the SDGs. Could you do the next slide? Oh, this is the history. Okay, next one. Yeah. In New York, PepsiCo, L'Oreal, Unilever, Pfizer, Etsy, Sony, they've all made SDG commitments. In the fashion industry, the finance industry. And on Wall Street, BlackRock and others are calling for long-term investments in sustainability and making huge green finance commitments. Goldman Sachs, $750 billion by 2030. Citi, $500 billion by 2030. JP Morgan, $2.5 trillion over 10 years. HSBC, $750 billion to $1 trillion by 2030. Bank of America, setting a target of $1.5 trillion. Business has embraced sustainability and the UN SDGs. Is it all greenwashing? We won't know until we try. I suggest that the next administration recognize value and channel those private sector commitments for New York City's economic recovery and future. Second, let's build on past citywide sustainability planning, identify critical shared goals, and create greater private sector representation and responsibility. Both Plan NYC and 2050 were the product of broad outreach across New York City. That outreach should take place again, and the private sector needs to be at the table with government and community leaders as a critical partner, not for its empowerment, but rather to create shared responsibility. I suggest the next administration ensure strong representation from different segments of the private sector, especially finance. Business as well as government and civil society must take on responsibility for the actual actions to achieve our goals. And commitments to action should be measurable, including increased financial investments by the private sector, from philanthropy to impact investments to traditional finance. Third, let's take a page from the Biden administration, bring a whole government approach and embed sustainability into every New York City agency, but particularly into economic development. President Biden made clear from day one that he would take a whole of government approach to sustainability. The president has underscored the crucial role of public-private collaboration to identify and scale solutions. New York City can similarly embed sustainability into the mission of every city agency. It can begin with New York City's Economic Development Corporation, our workforce and economic development engine for 30 years. I suggest that New York City's work to build a private sector role in achieving the SDGs should reside at EDC. I'm almost out of time. Let me get to my last point. Fourth, we need to bridge the goal setting and success with mayoral support for active cross-sector project development. What does that mean? A challenging gap exists between our sustainability goals and their achievement. Private investors tout billions of dollars committed to sustainability, But for projects to be financed, they must come investment ready. Rather than simply encouraging the matching of investment capital to investment ready projects, the next administration might consider the challenge we've undertaken at NYU Stern for Sustainable Business. The Invest NYC SDG project is the first local initiative in the world, according to the UN, to use the SDGs as a framework to drive private sector financing. We've identified key stakeholders to understand the barriers to achieving our goals, and together we've identified strategies and projects to overcome those barriers with persistent cross-sector development, engaging, connecting, matchmaking, and catalyzing. And we have a portfolio of projects designed to help New York City's economic recovery and advance equity and racial justice. Professor Sarah Kaufman will talk next about one, the Equitable Commute Project. So in conclusion, this is a pivotal moment for New York City's future. The pandemic is beginning to recede. A new administration will take office in January 2022 with its ambitions for the future. And with our rich political, economic, and civic culture, New York City is in a unique position to lead our nation's and our world's transition to a more sustainable, equitable, and resilient economy. As the business and finance capital of the United States, New York City can demonstrate how private enterprise and public policy can work hand in hand to create a more robust economy and improve the lives of all New Yorkers and drive the UN SDGs. We're in this together, business, investors, public sector, philanthropy, and the community, and our goals are urgent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariana, for your presentation. Really, really interesting and a great, it's been, as I said before, a pleasure to work with you and learn about all that you have done in the past and continue to do now in this very, very, very important and urgent area. I'm going to turn it to our last speaker, who, as you saw from Mariana's slide, is in partnership already with the center. And that's Sarah Kaufman, who actually is also connected with us here at NYU Wagner and the Rudin Center. And when we were seeking different sort of articles, Sarah wrote not one, but two, and volunteered to do it and did it in a really incredibly timely and enthusiastic fashion. And so, Sarah, I want to thank you for that and then turn it over to you to talk about the Equitable Commute Project. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. And timely and enthusiastic is my mode. So I appreciate the recognition on that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I am going to need permission from you, Raquel. Or if you'd like to share the slides that I sent you, you're welcome to do that. In the meantime, I'll start talking about the Equitable Commute Project, which is a, thank you, Raquel, which is a truly collaborative effort across NYU. The partners include NYU Stern, Mariana, especially the excellent and most enthusiastic partner, as well as the Rudin Center, where I am the associate director, where we focus on the future of transportation, as well as focusing specifically on technology and equity within urban mobility. Another partner is Electric Avenue, a small consultancy working on electrifying mobility. And then finally, transportation alternatives. And the last logo that fell off is the C2 Smart Center at the Tandon School of Engineering. So we have 3 NYU schools in on this project. So I'm very excited to have so much collaboration. If you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'll start out by saying that New Yorkers are asking, how can I safely and reliably get to work? People are hesitant during the pandemic, and I don't want to say they were hesitant during the pandemic, as it is still ongoing. And so the fear of taking public transit or using other modes can be really, can make people very nervous. Although we are seeing a rapid, or we are seeing an increase gradually in subway ridership up to about 3 million riders a day compared to pre-pandemic numbers of 5.5 million. So it is growing. However, the reliability is still a challenge. And that's especially a challenge for New York's 1 million essential workers. And usually when we think of essential workers, in the last year, we have thought of them as doctors and nurses, but we need to broaden that definition to include food prep workers, package sorters at mail centers, people on janitorial staff, as well as daycare teachers. These are all people who have kept New York running through the pandemic and continue to do so. Next slide, please. And there are some important characteristics of New York's 1 million essential workers. A quarter of them are low income. That means that 225,000 essential workers in New York are not earning enough to be considered middle income, but they continue to be working these essential services. 75% of them are people of color. They are majority women, and 37% are over the age of 50. Another thing I'd like to point out on the map on the right is that they tend to be concentrated in areas, they tend to live in areas that are kind of more on the outskirts of the city that are a bit harder to get to. Those are neighborhoods like Queens Village and Canarsie. You can see in this map, the darker shaded areas have higher numbers of essential workers who live in the city. And that becomes important when they're trying to get to work. So as you'll see on the next slide, we have, if you can go forward, yes. I know this map can be a bit hard to see, but you can see it more closely in the paper. During the peak of COVID, during the spring and summer of 2020, subway ridership massively declined. As you can see on this map, the red stations, the red subway stations are showing a decline of 92% in ridership. And you can see that throughout Midtown and downtown Manhattan. But there wasn't really a decline in lower income neighborhoods throughout Brooklyn and the Bronx, especially, and also Queens. So what does that tell us? It tells us that essential workers were still relying on the subway, even during the peak of COVID, more so than in other neighborhoods. And if you look on the next slide, you can see that not only were they relying on the subway, but the subway was less reliable during that time. The waiting time was longer, and especially the off-peak wait time in September 2020, for example, was 8.5 minutes. And when we talk about essential workers, these are people who are working on shift schedules. They're not working 9 to 5 peak hours as a white collar worker might. So this is a huge impact to people's ability to get to work on time and to have them wait safely and be able to rely on their hourly wages without getting docked any pay. So what is a solution? If you go in the next slide, some people might turn to cars, but I think it's clear that cars in New York City are not the answer. So first of all, when we talk about lower income essential workers, they can't afford cars. Secondly, New York City simply does not have more space for cars. As anyone who walks around the city knows, there is endless gridlock, and we can't, we just physically do not have the space for more vehicles. In addition, we're simultaneously going through a climate crisis, so we simply do not want to add more vehicles to New York City. So what is the solution? Next slide, please. We need transportation options that are broad enough so that people can take the option that is correct for them for their trips. We also need more resilient options because we're dealing with a sustainability crisis. And next slide. So one of the solutions is micromobility. And Raquel, I'm going to ask you to kind of, yeah, thank you. So micromobility, if you're not familiar with this term, is the kind of suite of small scale vehicles, including bikes, e-bikes, scooters, e-scooters, and mopeds as well. So I'm sure you've seen them out and about on city streets. One thing they are is resilient. You know, after Hurricane Ida, the day after, City Bike saw a record ridership day. People can turn to bikes when when the subway isn't running because it was flooded the night before, when their car engines are flooded, or when there's a power outage. We are able to use bikes and scooters still. It's also socially distanced. You know, it's not like other modes where you may be packed on top of each other. It doesn't congest the streets, despite kind of popular suspicions about that. It doesn't pollute like gas-powered vehicles do. It's fast. It can often be faster because it's door to door rather than public transit, which drops you perhaps near your destination, but not right at your destination. And it's also fun. I personally love riding a bike around the city, although, you know, there are safety concerns, which I will get into shortly. On the next slide, you'll see that New York is not alone in the massive increase in popularity for micromobility, especially in London and Paris, which have somewhat similar subway systems to New York. They have seen huge increases, and Paris, most notably, has converted one of its major roadways, basically their equivalent of Broadway, into a bike-centric road. So it's really interesting to see this kind of explosion of popularity of micromobility. Next slide. Thank you. But micromobility, these bikes and scooters, are really still unaffordable for many New Yorkers, especially the low-income New Yorkers that we're talking about. So e-scooters often cost about $500, and e-bikes often cost about $1,000. The one in this photo, the Van Moof, is about $4,000. It's kind of the Porsche of e-bikes, but still, it's out of reach for many people. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the Equitable Commute Project. And that is an effort to get employers to help sponsor 50% of the purchase price of micromobility vehicles for 5,000 low-income essential workers. This is the consortium effort that Mariana was talking about. And we are working right now with employers in the Bronx to help get these bikes and scooters to workers so that they can either get to work or they can use these vehicles for work, for example, for delivery jobs. In addition, we're partnering with Spring Bank, which is a bank in the Bronx, to be able to finance the remaining 50% of the purchase price for buyers without credit histories. Many times, low-income buyers will not have the credit needed to finance a big purchase. In addition, we will help with secure parking, which will also benefit them in terms of charging the vehicles, which is another cost challenge. Next slide, please. So what are the benefits? We think that because people can be using micromobility as more of a door-to-door transport method, they'll save about 5,000 hours in commuting time every day. There will be a greater diversity of users. Right now, micromobility vehicles are used recreationally by wealthier, predominantly male populations, and this will give access to a broader base of users, as well as the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions and creating jobs, both by getting people options to travel to more job opportunities, as well as creating jobs like bike mechanics and charging station workers, etc. Next slide, please. We will be working at the Rudin Center with the C2 Smart Center to measure the safety ratings of these trips to see what's working. We'll look at corridors that people are popularly traveling on and see if they are safe and effective modes. We'll see how much people are saving their time and money. We'll see, and whether they're able to access job opportunities that they couldn't before, as well as how many emissions are being avoided. I'll wrap it up now because I know that we're short on time. Just by saying that we should have bike boulevards, that we can have room for bikes to travel safely, to keep bikes out of the path of cars and reduce street conflicts, to improve safety for cyclists, pedestrians, as well as keep vehicle traffic moving. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions about it. I saw some coming through in the chat, which I will address at the appropriate time. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Fantastic for the presentation. So I'm going to suggest, suddenly my lighting got like weird. Okay, I'm going to actually sort of just start with an overarching question, and then please do, as is indicated, send your questions through the chat, and we're going to try to actually go to some of those questions rather quickly to get enough time in. We have about 22 minutes left. 22 minutes and I'll give you the world. So let's do this. So as you know, I've now read everyone's paper a few times, and I first of all, I love it, and I want to thank everybody for their time. And so I'm wondering whether or not you can let's get practical, right? So you have some, fantastic sort of recommendations. How does this get implemented if we want to implement, right? Who's in the lead? Because it sounds like we're throwing a lot of things out there. And I just want to know from your perspective, if you were given the opportunity to lead this or run this, who are we talking about? And how do we do that in a way that's inclusive? And why don't we kind of go first, I guess, Karen, you want to say a word or two about, in your mind, it seems like your recommendation, you think this is a mayoral, sort of lead. How do you think about it?
Right. I think just given the struggles we've observed in coordinating rescue funds across other cities, I think the way to think about it is if this were housed within, I think, the staffing challenge, and I regret that I don't have more intricate knowledge of New York City's budget in terms of how hiring works, but I think in terms of hiring people quickly, identifying an outside entity, whether it's a philanthropy or a nonprofit, that could hire, whether it's between 1 to 10 staff, headed by, probably for infrastructure, a trusted infrastructure or public transit leader within the city, who could hire staff that could lend research support, planning support, data analytics support, these people who know how to navigate the legislative process and actually interpret these bills. I think hiring people quickly who can then also act as conveners and have relationships across the spectrum. So it's more about the number of people that you're hiring, where they sit. Are you hiring people who have connections to the right public authorities, who are engaged, and people who actually have the leadership and the respect to actually get people to answer their calls and show up to meetings and show up to conversations? So at its simplest level, it's about staffing, just because within all the entities that are receiving these funds, no one has the time or the capacity to think beyond their specific lane and their specific set of projects. And I think it's bringing people together who can kind of sit above and convene while not actually directing people or telling them what to do. So I think that's just tactically how this could happen. But I think, I don't want to jump ahead to one of your other questions, there are real challenges with that in terms of trust. Who's trusted to bring people together? Are they going to bring all voices to the table and listen to all, every corner of the city? I think that's a real challenge in terms of identifying who those partners are that people will trust to convene and trust that all types of voices will be heard. I think it's really difficult, and the dynamic is totally different in every city.
Great, thank you, Karen. So there's a question that just came in specifically for you, Gail. But I think that this question, the original question for you, is also incredibly useful because the pension funds are also complicated. Let me just read to you the question that came in, if I may. It says, are there safeguards so that pension funds won't be strong-armed to invest in pet projects that may not be good investments as well. So just that, and then your sort of idea of like, if we want to implement this and do it practically, what steps, what are the next steps and who's involved?
So I'm not sure, and to whomever asked this question, and just a quick overview, the New York City pension funds are actually run, there are 5 different pension funds, and they're a board. So it's not just one person who gets to make a decision and it can go off the rails and say, this is a pet project of mine. So the NYCers, for example, let's just take the employee retirement system, has representatives from all of the different unions, from the mayor's office, the Department of Finance, the New York City Controller's office. And so that actually ensures those kinds of transparency and accountability issues. Plus, the pension funds are accountable to the retirees and have to achieve a certain level of return. And so if they don't, and they don't meet their return numbers, the city actually has to start to make up those benefits. And so there are built-in guardrails to prevent from that type of parochial point of view in terms of how the projects get funded. We have this issue currently with the pension funds. They have to make decisions. They're investment advisors who will analyze and look at all of the options on the table and to be sure that there is a return. So there is a fiduciary duty to be sure that you are investing in projects that have a return and are not political. So hopefully that answers your question. The other question, Martha, I think you were asking about, how do we do this? How do we get this done? And I've actually thought a little bit about this. It's an interesting time in government, right? We have a lot of shifting sands, right? We have a new mayoralty coming in. The governor's office is going through a lot of changes. And there are a lot of other roles in the city that will be new. There will be a new controller. The city council will be different, a city council speaker, the borough president. So there are a lot of new actors at the table. And so that gives you an opportunity to get everybody in the room, and whomever that, I mean, it could be the mayor, it could be, we could talk about all the benefits about who it should be. But I do think, to Karen's point, the idea of an infrastructure czar for the city of New York would be a really important role, because there is so much opportunity on the table right now, and there's so many great ideas. We heard a couple of them today. My head is already kind of spinning like, ooh. I think that to have an infrastructure czar would give us an opportunity to bring the public, the private, and the public sectors and the authorities. Having been the president of one of those authorities, there are resources and opportunities and ways, and I think that people would be very amenable to coming to the table. It's a rare opportunity, and we should just get started.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to give Mariana an opportunity to, your paper pretty much kind of lays out what you think needs to happen and who needs to do it. And then there's several questions, as is what happens, where there's a practical or like an idea out there. And now the questions that are coming in are all around actually the equitable commute project. So I'm going to give Sarah, you a chance in a moment to actually address some of the concerns that are being expressed in the chat about the project itself. But Mariana, your thoughts. Let's say you became, the mayor or the controller or the city. Who's doing this and how do we get it done practically?
Well, I like the practical. So often I think we're way up here with these very important goals, and the piece of figuring out what the actual actions are and who does what gets lost in that whole discussion of visioning. I guess my appeal would be to our likely mayor, Eric Adams, and his new administration. I would urge that the mayor, after November 2nd, be looking at the next sustainability plan, see it as this unique convening platform. And I would have at my dining room table at Gracie Mansion, maybe Jamie Dimon, Larry Fink, and Darren Walker to begin with, and talk about how we were going to do it differently. We're evolving it. We've had incredible leadership from Mayor Bloomberg, Mayor de Blasio, and now we need to take this next step and bring the private sector and make them responsible.
That's great. And I think, Mariana, there was a question specifically for you. Aside from appealing to kind of altruistic tendencies, how do you suggest we bring the private sector into the fold in order to harness their resources? And you kind of touched on that a little bit by what kind of convening you think would be kind of necessary right after November 2nd. And some of even sort of Sarah's suggestions also are around appealing to those altruistic tendencies. So,
well, I heard a loud hoot that somehow emerged beyond the mute from the audience. So I appreciate that hoot. I don't want to be naive. I think, though, that mayoral leadership can be actually quite important. And I think it's taking the financial commitments that have been made by the private sector, all of these announcements, and saying concretely, how are you going to translate that $750 billion over the next 10 years to actions here in New York City? You have 10,000 employees in New York City, you're invested. What are you going to do? Here are the pieces. Do you agree that these are our goals? Are we all at the table and these are the goals? What piece of this can you take so that when we have that grid that we report on, it includes not just the government agency, but then those companies, foundations, and community organizations who have been at the table, who identified a role they can play, they then agree to measurable steps that they can take. And Sarah, I see you're getting beat up on the Equitable Commute Project. I'm happy to jump in and not leave you alone, having thought about a lot of these issues over the last nearly 2 years.
I wouldn't call it getting beat up. I think that, you kind of always know when you're onto something when people actually have a reaction to it. That's actually, as a person who's done a lot on taxes, you never walk in talking about taxes and people are like, yes, that is correct. So the fact that folks are engaged is, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And so the fact is that people are giving you a lot of maybe you might feel it as hate, but it's actually interaction, and that's really helpful. And sort of among the things that are being said, and I don't think you make light of it. The first kind of comment that came in was that equitable commuting is not kind of enough, that we really do need to make sure our current transportation system is safe and reliable. And that's certainly something that you've been working on, but also some pushback, I think, because, one of the things we want to do is be inclusive, asking the question of whether or not in the lower income neighborhoods that you describe, I grew up in Brownsville and, near Canarsie in East New York, have we been in touch to know whether or not these are actually methods for getting in, especially if it's to the central business district in Manhattan that work for people. So I think you've seen some of the questions. So take one or two of them and, give your best response.
Sure. Thank you all for the questions. And if I can't get to them during this session, I'll be sure to answer them outside of the panel. But the essential message that you need to keep in mind is that these workers are not usually commuting to the central business district. They're commuting to the hospitals in the south of Brooklyn or the North Bronx, the airports in Eastern Queens, and package sorting facilities, perhaps on the far west side of Manhattan or in Queens. And so these workers are not necessarily commuting into Wall Street, and it's pretty unlikely that they are. And so when we talk about commutes, we need to broaden our definition of what a commute is. There's another question about mobility needs, and my response there is that no, this isn't a program for everybody. This is an opt-in program for people who might benefit from it. And there are several micromobility devices in development that'll be immensely helpful for people who do not have the physical capacity to, say, ride a bike, but instead can use a motorized bike or even motorized wheelchairs or scooters that are seated. These are immensely helpful. And so you're right, not some elderly daycare teacher may not opt into this program, but for, say, New York City's 65,000 food delivery workers, this may be an immensely helpful program. And Mariana, I'm going to ask you to jump in. And since you've been taking the lead on community outreach, I would love for you to talk about the work that's already being done in the Bronx.
Sure. So we've been working over the last year and a half doing outreach, beginning with the Bronx. And we have a list already of more than 600 people who want access to micromobility vehicles, e-bikes generally. And the great value of it is that I say, they're good for all ages and fitness levels. What we've found in working with Spring Bank particularly is that they have an employee opportunity loan system so that people who have no access to credit are able through their employer to access lending for the acquisition of a micromobility bike. It could be, we are hoping to get subsidies for up to 50%. Whether it's from the employer or if the legislation that's pending before New York State actually creates a subsidy for micromobility akin to the long time subsidy that's been available for electric vehicles that cost $50,000 a piece. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been provided. And this is just another piece of, I think, transportation justice and creating that kind of incentive. But we see big demand. We've worked with Bronx Works, The Point, the HOPE program is one of our partners because we are also working to create a green workforce that would support micromobility, both in the bike maintenance, the battery supplies, and the storage and parking. So it's huge. It's coming fast, and we're way behind many cities, but I would invite people to join us in this project.
I think that, the kind of key here, right, is to have as many options as are available. Again, I hesitate to keep doing this, but, we used to say at the Department of Finance, we wanted to give people lots of options to pay us the right amount on time by whatever means necessary. They want to pay us online. They want to pay us by coming in. I always used to tell the story of the people who paid in person and they come in and pull money out of their bosom. If they want to do it that way, that works too. So just sort of thinking about having multiple options. And I do agree with some of the comments that, yes, we also need to make sure our, most important and viable sort of an existing system is both safe and efficient and effective, but giving people lots of ways to, get to work and get in and around the city to enjoy all that the city has to offer is equally sort of important. Let me see if there's anything else that's wandering in the chat that I'm not addressing kind of quickly. And if so, we have about 2 minutes or so left before we need to sort of close off. I think biodiversity, thinking about food, and I think even Mariana, what you talked about in terms of Rikers and how we could create sort of sustainable stuff there was for me very, very fascinating as well. Okay, so things to watch out for. Things to watch out for. What would you say, could go wrong from your perspective? And you could do it in like a 1-sentence thing. Karen, what could go wrong?
Oh, I think what could go wrong is if people don't try to do anything differently, we will not see any improvements in racial equity. I think the status quo is what could go wrong.
That's great, thank you. Gail.
I was thinking the same thing, the status quo, but you know what? And somebody mentioned it in the chat, and I really do believe that we really have to avoid groupthink, and that we don't get bogged down, and that we really keep a forward motion, and that just because it's a new idea and it may not be somebody's first choice idea, that there's no one right idea, that we need to do it all. To Martha's point on the transportation, the more options, the better. So the more we do, the better. And so just to people start to get bogged down and focus on one thing and realize that we're not going to do anything. And that's a fear.
Great. Thank you. Mariana.
What could go wrong is that the pandemic continues and evolves, and we live with it for a long time. And I think that that'll create a lot of difficulty in achieving any of our goals.
Sarah.
And I agree with the previous statements, and to add that there is kind of a lack of urgency, not only in looking at the pandemic, but as well as a lack of urgency in addressing climate change. Much like we all collaborated and tried to flatten the curve together by staying home and wearing masks, we need to do the same in terms of climate change. And so a major way to do that is through transportation. And so I hope people can see that.
So we're at 10:29 and very mindful of everyone's time, and want to just really thank you all for this our initiation into our road to recovery discussion. Really appreciate your papers and your thoughts, and sharing everything here. Want to thank the Stern Center. Certainly thank NYU Wagner and the dean. The advisory board, who has been incredibly awesome, Raquel Forrester, who really kept us all in line and made sure this happened, and my really smart and fun to work with colleague Thad Calabrese. I will close actually this week with a kind of Colin Powell quote, in part because he was a White House fellow many years before I was a White House fellow, but I did have the pleasure of meeting him during our fellowship year. And one of the things that I just am hopeful that we will do with this project, and certainly in the upcoming sort of weeks and months, is that he said that perpetual optimism is a force multiplier. So a force multiplier. And what I love about this project is the minds that came together to really generate perpetual optimism about New York City, even as we struggle with all of these sort of issues. And I hope we can keep that optimism alive. And again, thank you so much for your time and energy and for all your questions. We'll keep those questions, and perhaps what we'll do is post some answers to them on our website. Please do visit the website. We'll be posting additional papers as some of them come in and we edit them. But thank you so much. This has been really fun, and I look forward to seeing you at future ones. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Thank you, Martha.
Thank you.
Thad.
Thanks, Martha, for everything.
Thank you, Raquel.
Thanks, Raquel.